5 books and counting. The Tales from the Omni Vault continues to expand as a universe. Go ahead and check the links down in the description to get your copies today. Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am the Omni Viewer, and welcome to Genre Benders, Obscurities, and Flawed Gems, where we look at the best stuff you've never heard of. Well, I've finally seen Shin Ultraman, and guess what? I like it. It's not perfect, mind you, but it's an overall good film, and leagues better than Shin Godzilla. If you're confused, don't worry, all will be made clear by the end. Really? That's a rare occurrence when Hideaki Anno is involved. That it is, Snazzy, and I've got a lot to say about this movie, but first, let's do the plot summary to make sure everyone's on the same page. Monsters of all shapes and sizes have been showing up in Japan, prompting the formation of the SSSSP, a team of experts specially qualified to handle these beasts. During an attack by Naranga, the first kaiju to have a familiar physiognomy, things escalate unexpectedly when a UFO lands in the creature's path. That UFO turns out to be a silver giant that the world will come to know as Ultraman. Naranga is quickly disposed of, and the world is forever changed, as is a member of the SSSSP. Shinji Kaminaga had gone out to save a child during the incident, and Ultraman practically landed on top of him, yet he walked away without so much as a bruise, and he's been acting strangely ever since. As it turns out, Ultraman has placed himself into Shinji's body, and now walks among humans in hopes of understanding them as he protects them from harm. Yet between continued kaiju attacks and the arrival of other aliens, Ultraman has his work cut out for him, and his interference may have consequences that reach much further than the shoreline of Japan. If you've been following me for long enough, you would know that I was skeptical about this movie from the beginning. After the miserable experience of Shin Godzilla, I had little reason to think that Hideaki Anno and Shinji Higuchi could handle the Ultra series. The trailers presented the same aesthetic as that first film, and the special effects didn't look quite right. Even as people who saw it before me remained confident that I would like it better, I was still bracing myself for another round of soapboxing dialogue delivered by hollow mouthpieces with pretty yet bland shots of monsters doing nothing of interest. You can imagine my surprise then when what I got was an Ultraman movie. Like an actual proper Ultraman movie, albeit one with a few elements that remind you of who's behind the camera. Like I said, it's not perfect, but for the most part it does what it's supposed to do. And that's more than I can say for Shin Godzilla. This isn't just gonna be about you bashing on Shin Godzilla again, is it? I'll avoid that to the best of my abilities, but I keep bringing Shin Godzilla up for a reason. You see, even though the same creative team is behind both movies, Shin Ultraman is a vastly different film from Shin Godzilla. In fact, if you don't like Shin Godzilla, that should not deter you from checking it out. Even though Shin Ultraman still does have a few of the issues that Shin Godzilla did. May as well get the negative stuff out of the way first. For starters, I criticized Shin Godzilla for how it kept recycling musical cues and sound effects rather than coming up with totally new stuff. Shin Ultraman doubles down on that. Nearly every sound effect you hear is recycled from the original series. They're even mixed the same way, right down to the explosions cutting each other off when they go in rapid succession. Speaking of which, it even recycles music from Shin Godzilla, including the most infamous track. You know the one.
All flights out of Narita have been canceled. We have several reports of...
Seriously, I don't know why Anno keeps doing stuff like this. For authenticity, perhaps? Perhaps, but there has to be a middle ground of some sort. I enjoy the original Ultra series music as much as any fan, and I'm not against hearing it in the film, but how about doing new versions of it? Think about what American remakes and reboots do. If there's an iconic piece of music from an earlier version of something, does the remake just recycle that old music? No, it records a new version. Sometimes it even does a full-blown orchestral version, or reinterprets it somehow to fit the overall tone of the new interpretation. Maybe Anno has his reasons for not taking a similar approach and just recycling what already exists, but I can't fathom what they are. Unless he's just cheap, that is.
Speaking of recycling, you might also recognize a few reused elements from Shin Godzilla, specifically the rooms within the Capitol building, as well as Yutaka Takanouchi playing Hideki Akasaka 2.0. The character is never named on screen, but it's basically the same role. And yes, I would be remiss not to mention how Gomez uses Shin Godzilla as a base.
All of that stuff was probably some super meta reference to how a lot of Godzilla things were recycled by Tsuburaya Productions for the Ultra series, so that alone is not in and of itself a critique. I just wanted to point it out. But what about the characters? That's something I really insist on being good in a story, and as I've said before, Shin Godzilla has no characters at all. Instead, what it has is a line of human-shaped megaphones that Anno is constantly running between to make it sound like his political diatribe is coming from multiple different sources. Shin Ultraman does improve on this element, but not as much as it could have.
On the one hand, the characters here are written as individuals rather than a hive mind. They have exchanges in which they each respond in ways that are distinct to them. Akihisa Taki is very high-strung and tends to get frustrated when something doesn't make sense. Yumi Funaberi, by contrast, tends to act more with annoyance to such scenarios, and she's not one to give up when faced with a problem. Put the two of them together to have an exchange, and it feels like two different people talking. We also know different aspects about the kind of people they are in their personal lives, even if we only ever see them on the job.
That being said, I would not call any of the human characters fully fleshed out. You see, even though we know more about them than the characters from Shin Godzilla, that doesn't mean all that information necessarily matters.
For example, we are told that Funaberi is married, but we never meet her spouse, nor does she bring up her marriage at any point in the film. Taki is described as a nerd who decorates his workspace with memorabilia from Star Trek and Thunderbirds, another meta-reference.
However, as a nerd myself, I know that real nerds constantly make nerd references in conversation, something that Taki never does.
He also never interacts with the models that are supposedly his. Ergo, it feels like calling him a nerd is a convenient explanation for why all these toys are in a government office.
What about the team leader, Kimio Tamura? Yes, he is also in the movie, and we know even less about him.
Again, he's an individual who has a particular way of commanding his team and taking control of dire situations, and he even appears to have a mild sense of whimsy. Why else would he have this plushie on his desk? That said, though, we get even fewer insights into his character than the rest of the team.
That, of course, leaves Hiroko Asami, who we get to know better than the rest, but not by much.
We know that she's the newest recruit, and she's meant to be specifically partnered with Kaminaga, so it's personally frustrating that he seems so distant and rarely shows up to work. After all, she wants to be his buddy, and his emotional coldness is making that difficult. Nonetheless, she's excited to be on the team, but not to an unprofessional level, and she'll take the initiative on her own when necessary. One throwaway line implies that she might have a wild side on her time off, though this is never elaborated on. Oh, and she expresses enthusiasm by grabbing her own butt.
Don't ask me, I don't know why. It's weird, if this were a comedy anime, I probably wouldn't think twice about this, but in live action, it's a little weird.
Speaking of inappropriate behavior, Hiroko is also the subject of Shin Ultraman's most infamous scene. Basically, she interacted with alien technology that needs to be found, and the only way for Ultraman to track it is by scent, specifically her scent, which means he has to spend a long time leaning in and getting a good whiff of her BO.
It is every bit as uncomfortable and awkward as it sounds, and I really don't know what it's doing in this movie.
Anyway, among the human cast, Hiroko comes the closest to being multidimensional, but I don't think she quite gets all the way there because she remains largely unchanged throughout the proceedings. As a result, I consider the human cast to be comprised not of characters, but rather of archetypes with various quirks.
They're more interesting than the cardboard cutouts from Shin Godzilla, but I doubt they'll be making anybody's list of best human characters from the Ultra series. That may be so, Omni, but I'm sure everyone noticed that you've been specifying human during this part of the video. That must mean you're moving on to the non-human characters, and you'll no doubt explain how they're handled differently. I am what I am, and that's all that I am, Snazzy. But you're right. The non-human is where this video goes next. And that's where things see greater improvement. I realize that up to this point I have been picking on Shin Ultraman quite a bit. However, like I said at the beginning, I do enjoy this movie despite its flaws, and from here on out, I'll be explaining why. And naturally, you'll be starting with the monsters and aliens, right? Of course, but before I get to that, let's address something that I expressed as a concern in other videos: the special effects.
Part of why the trailers didn't thrill me was because the CGI for the creature effects didn't look very good. Oh, the characters looked detailed and the designs were good, though I'll elaborate on those in a bit, but the rendering itself was off. It looked to me like they had a weird plasticky sheen that made them look kinda fake, and that naturally had me worried about how good the film would be visually.
Well, the special effects still retain that artificial look, but having watched the film several times, I've come to the conclusion that it must have been deliberate. What got me thinking about this is this sequence with Hiroko right here.
In the movie's third quarter, Hiroko gets embiggened by Mephilas, recreating one of the original series' more surreal moments involving Fujiko. Now take a good long look at her. Does something look off about her complexion? Here, let me contrast it with a picture of her normal appearance. See it now? Giant Hiroko has the same plastic sheen on her skin and clothing as the monsters.
This is very strange considering all they would have had to do was film the real actress on a green screen, but instead they rendered her with that weird digital appearance.
Dialogue about her strange condition also implies that being enlarged has completely altered her physiology, as evidenced by how no skin or cloth samples can be taken from her.
Ergo, I believe this had to be a deliberate aesthetic choice.
The monsters and aliens are supposed to look a bit off, like they don't really belong in the world, and something about them is truly otherworldly. This is conveyed by having the CGI rendered to not quite be photoreal. I have to say, that was very well played if my guess is on the mark.
Even before I dwelt on all of that though, I didn't hate the designs. They all retain the recognizable aspects of the classic monsters, with a few upgrades that make sense.
Ultraman himself didn't change much, but his lanky proportions helped to make him look appropriately alien. Gabora's odd frills that originally just served to protect his head are now repurposed into a massive drill, with the addition of his dorsal ridges becoming dual rows of corkscrews. Neranga's extra spines that seemed haphazardly applied on the original suit now look uniform and deliberate. Zarab's extreme reimagining as a nearly two-dimensional entity makes him visually memorable, especially when his weird appearance is contrasted with his normal-sounding voice. Mephilas is given a slender appearance to match Ultraman's, thus visually conveying the idea that he is the hero's physical equal. Zeton's abstract visage takes some getting used to, but it's still recognizable as Zeton. And in case you're wondering, yes, I even like how Gomez looks. In fact, it looks better than the original Shin Godzilla base, particularly in how the proportions feel more natural.
But then again, looks aren't everything.
Let's not forget that the special effects in Shin Godzilla were stellar, with Godzilla only looking bad in just a couple of shots. Yet despite looking so real most of the time, he doesn't actually do that much and winds up being one of the least interesting takes on the character ever put to film.
My greatest concern was that history would repeat itself with Shin Ultraman. And boy was I glad to be wrong.
Okay, technically there are only two proper kaiju that we spend any length of time with, those being Neranga and Gabora.
As brief as their appearances are, though, they still deliver. I'm not going to oversell it and claim that these two are somehow more complex than the human characters, but they both have very clear personalities that are on display whenever they're on screen. And there are subtleties that make them very different from each other.
Neranga constantly advances towards his goals and reacts violently when he doesn't get what he wants. Yet when confronted with Ultraman, a foe who shrugs off his attacks without flinching, he immediately retreats in fear, implying that he's kind of a typical bully who loves dishing it out but can't take it. Gabora seems to be the same at first, but when Ultraman puts up a fight, he doesn't retreat. Instead, he adopts different strategies, each one showing a degree of intelligence not seen in the more primitive Neranga. You see that? Kaiju with personalities. It can be done.
But the bulk of this movie belongs to the extraterrestrials, as the script insists on calling them. This is where you'll come to understand why I said that the human characters were not that interesting, because where they lack, the extraterrestrials more than compensate.
Ultraman himself is not depicted in the typical way that ultra heroes usually are. Classically, the Giants of Light are pretty good at blending in with humanity, and they tend to be quite friendly. Those who adopt human hosts will also let those hosts retain their autonomy.
This take on Ultraman, however, is meant to be a bit more alien than others. It's actually quite fortunate that he wound up in the body of someone who was already introverted and closed off, because he is terrible at passing for human.
The thing is, though, that he's learning, and although he remains fairly stoic and distant, you can still see him subtly change throughout the film. That change becomes apparent during his confrontation with Zoffi, who retains a truly alien sense of right and wrong that leads him to become the final villain, though I'll say more about that later.
This is where I must give praise to the actor's performance.
Takumi Saito does a great job conveying the idea of an alien wearing a human suit, a concept that's a bit less grotesque here than it is in Men in Black. Take the scene where he has drinks with Mephilas. He remains oddly still for most of the scene, and even though he's not looking at Mephilas, he's not just staring into space either. His intense expression shows that he's clearly focused, even if he's not making eye contact with his foe.
As an actor myself, I can tell you that this is not easy to do, especially when you're trying not to look directly into the camera. So, kudos to him.
Moving on to Zarab, or as he's known on Amazon, The Love, he's an especially devious figure. His polite demeanor immediately contrasts with his nice supernatural abilities, and he comes across as creepy from the onset despite betraying no reason why he shouldn't be trusted. Deep down you know he's not really trustworthy, but he's so good at covering his tracks that you're not sure why until he shows his true colors to Ultraman.
The casual way he likens humans to vermin that need exterminating is certainly an alien perspective, but it's also a dark mirror to our hero's perspective.
Think about it. Ultraman doesn't go into this movie understanding humanity, but we see throughout that he's learning, and what he learns is combined with the presence of a human soul within him, thus developing into a deep fondness for people. Zarab also has a crude knowledge of humanity. He must know quite a bit if he's such an adept politician, but he remains unimpressed. He acknowledges their virtues, but does not think those make them worthy of preserving, especially not if they're in the way of his goals. We have two very alien perspectives from two similar sources, and yet they arrive at very different stations. And of course, Zarab's status as the twisted reflection of Ultraman is made fully apparent in how he impersonates the hero as part of his deception.
Brief sidebar, but I wonder about the significance of his attire in these scenes.
Whenever Zarab interacts with humanity, he wears clothes that make him look like a Cold War-era spy, revealing his face but otherwise concealing his bizarre appearance. These interactions are where he's being deceitful, yet in the scenes he shares with Ultraman, we see him without his costume, or any clothes for that matter, and he's being perfectly honest there.
So could it be symbolic that Zarab is at his most honest when he's totally nude? Well, if that's true, wouldn't that just contrast him even more with Ultraman since he's also being honest while disguised as Kaminaga? Good point. Maybe the ultimate takeaway is that your exterior doesn't matter when your insides are rotten.
Mephilas is another alien whose polite mannerisms obscure a sinister motive, but he's even worse than Zarab. You see, Mephilas is presented as the mastermind, a Moriarty type, you might say.
While he takes no credit for unleashing the original wave of kaiju, he is behind everything that happens after the Ultra Q sequence.
From intentionally unleashing monsters like Naranga and Gabora to taking advantage of Zarab's failure, he's the source of everything behind the scenes before making his presence known.
Now, he says he abhors violence and hates the fact that he has to fight Ultraman, but this has nothing to do with him being a pacifist.
Rather, his aversion to violence is based on not wanting to get his hands dirty. He simply prefers exploiting loopholes and manipulating people over resorting to fisticuffs. Brute force is necessary, but it's best left to the underlings and the fools who unknowingly play into his weird-looking hands.
If that's pacifism, then Lex Luthor really is the hero of every Superman story, and we all know that's not true.
Really, the only alien who suffers from lack of characterization is Zeton, whose immense size is inversely proportional to the personality he displays.
This is because his role is to essentially be a giant cannon, and if he were the only opponent in the movie, I might take more umbrage with this depiction. Fortunately, he's not.
The movie delivers plenty of interesting foes prior to him showing up, so it has bought itself the luxury of having a final enemy who exists purely to be an unfeeling juggernaut.
If you think about it, the fact that he's emotionless and unexpressive actually makes sense, seeing as how he's an agent of cold, impartial death. So in a way, he embodies the concept quite well.
Even if you don't buy that, his lack of emotion is offset by Zophy, but that requires us to delve into the movie's themes. We'll get to those in a minute, but my hope at this point is that you understand why I think the kaiju side of Shin Ultraman was handled so well. True, there are many fan favorites who didn't make the cut, but those who did got some darn good treatment.
If the choice is between a handful of kaiju with good characterization and a menagerie of kaiju who barely have a chance to take a breath before they're disposed of, I'll take the former any day. The reason I didn't mention Zophy during the kaiju and extraterrestrial portion is because his role ties more into the themes of the movie. And yet again, I'm actually surprised at how well the themes were handled.
First and foremost, yes, there is still some political commentary in Shin Ultraman, but it's nowhere near as pervasive as Shin Godzilla. It's most prominent in the segments with Zarab and Mephiles, since that's how they're trying to conquer Earth, but it flows naturally from the story and does not supersede the characterizations.
The message here is obvious. You can always count on bureaucrats to make the wrong kind of decision so long as you dangle the right kind of carrot in front of them.
No lies detected there.
That being said, though, the politicians are not depicted as totally inept or flat.
During Zarab's portion of the plot, it's understandable why so many in the crowd would fall for the alien's deception, as he's playing directly into their fears and desires by saying what they want to hear and including just enough truth among his lies that he sounds very convincing. Even then, however, we see that doubt remains among certain members, which makes the portrayal of this theme more realistic.
In the end, though, the movie isn't really that concerned with discussing politics.
This aspect has little to do with the beginning of the film, and ultimately has very little to do with the finale. In fact, Ultraman ultimately tells the politicians that they should back the heck out of his business and let him do his own thing, which they agree to.
Huh. Who knew Ultraman was libertarian?
With the politicians removed, though, the movie gets a bit more philosophical. The final foe Ultraman faces is not a monster or an alien, but rather one of his own brethren.
Zophy arrives on Earth to assess what's been going on and determines that humanity must be destroyed for the good of the whole universe, but Ultraman swears that he will resist and protect mankind to his last breath.
Zophy reaches this conclusion because both Zarab and Mephiles tried pulling the same plan in rapid succession.
Now, quick aside, I was initially unsure about the choice to have these plots repeated, as I initially thought it made the movie feel repetitive. I mean, the parallels between their arcs are impossible to ignore. They have similar introductory scenes of teleporting into a room so they can politely introduce themselves, they both show impressive manipulation over computers, they both do political maneuvering to achieve their goals, and they both end up having public battles with Ultraman.
It's not often you see that kind of plot repetition within the confines of one movie. The only other time I've seen it before is in Jupiter Ascending, and that movie was terrible, so that might have colored my first viewing of the film.
But you implied that your thoughts changed.
It did, and that's probably because I showed it to my parents. You see, my parents grew up with the original Ultraman, and so I wanted to show them this movie to see what their perspective on it would be. Not only did they like it, but my mother actually pointed out why this particular plot repetition works. It shows that this is becoming an actual problem.
The fact that two aliens acting independently had the same idea at roughly the same time is a very bad sign. Clearly, humanity is a precious commodity to the rest of the universe, but they are also dangerous. Mephiles in particular showed that terrestrial beings can be weaponized, and he clearly won't be the last one to make a move on them. As such, Zophy opts for a preemptive strike, since you can't weaponize something that no longer exists.
Then again, there might be a different kind of fear hiding behind this rationalization.
Zophy states that mankind is projected to develop in similar manner to the Ultras, and recent events have potentially sped that timeline up. Perhaps Zophy sees mankind not just as a threat to the universe, but as a threat to the Land of Light specifically, and thus he chooses his home and his people over those who might one day rival and surpass them.
Yet Ultraman, whose real name by the way is Lipia, doesn't see things that way.
True, he has seen people make mistakes and get duped, but he has also seen the best of what humanity has to offer, and his fusion with a human soul has given him even greater insight into the human condition than Zoffi could ever hope to have on his own.
This is where Anno and Taguchi remembered to incorporate something that could have been easily overlooked.
Let's go back to the original Ultraman for a moment and ask ourselves, who is he? Well, he is a benevolent being of pure light who comes to Earth and forges a covenant with a man doomed to die. When this mortal man accepts the light into himself, he is granted immortality and becomes something more than human.
Oh, I see where this is going. You're saying that Ultraman is a Christ allegory, right?
I am indeed, and I'm not just grasping at straws.
Eiji Tsuburaya, the creator of the Ultra series, had converted to Catholicism when he got married, and as a result, he started incorporating elements of his faith into his work. We can see such elements in Mothra, what with her ability to resurrect from the dead, her fondness for church bells, and the presence of a cross in her sigil. Ultraman also incorporates these elements, as mentioned. True, none of those elements line up exactly with the Bible, but it is only allegory. Ultraman reflects Christ without being a literal depiction thereof.
This is retained in Shin Ultraman. Sure, Ultraman himself refutes the claim that he is a god, but the elements are still there.
Ultraman is both celestial and human, descended from above to save the world and willing to sacrifice himself for the sake of the people. We can even see it in the finale when Ultraman and Zoffi have their last conversation. After Ultraman sacrifices himself to stop Zeton, the initially wrathful Zoffi meets him in an interdimensional tomb. It seems Zoffi has softened and is now willing to spare the Earth from destruction.
You might also recall that one of Zoffi's fears about mankind is that they might become like the Giants of Light one day, a sentiment that might sound mildly familiar to anyone who's read the Book of Genesis.
Essentially, the allegory is that Zoffi embodies the wrath of God, which is cast aside after the Christ-like sacrifice provided by Ultraman. The surprising thing is that this allegory is presented naturally rather than obviously or with a sense of self-awareness. Much like in the original series, the themes simply arise from the story and wait to be noticed rather than loudly announce themselves and bash you over the head with how deep they think they are.
Considering how blatant the last Shin movie from Anno and Taguchi was, I'm truly amazed that this was accomplished.
Well, Anno has made stuff with religious themes before.
Correction, Snazzy. He has made stuff with religious imagery. It's a point of fact that Neon Genesis Evangelion only used religious and Christian elements for aesthetic reasons, while its themes were psychological. Shin Ultraman actually does have Christian themes within it, which were retained from the original series.
Whatever. Anyway, is there anything else to discuss?
Probably, but this video's getting really long, so I think I'll summarize things here.
Like I said, I was skeptical about Shin Ultraman after the fiasco that is Shin Godzilla, and there's no denying that it has some noticeable issues. That said, it gets far more things right than it gets wrong, and it even improves upon things that Shin Godzilla messed up. Ergo, despite not being perfect, I still find it to be a worthy entry in the Ultra series.
The only question left is if grabbing your own butt really does get you pumped up for adventure.
You know, there's only one way to find out.
Good point, no time like the present. Yeah! Hey Earth, Garen! You and me in the ring before this wears off, let's go! Okay, so, important note. Grabbing your own butt only makes you think you can take on a kaiju. It does not actually make you capable of doing so. I need to lie down.
Thank you all for watching. Now be sure to head down to the description to check us out on other platforms, as well as find links to the 5 current books in the Tales from the Omni Vault universe. Again, thank you all, and we'll see you next time.